Bill Gates chuckled when Senator Kennedy mentioned God. 3 minutes later, the entire tech world was silent. The air in the Seattle Summit Hall was thin and cold, scrubbed clean by industrial-grade purifiers and chilled to a precise 68 degrees Fahrenheit. It was the kind of air that smelled of nothing and everything at once. Of ozone from 1,000 silently humming servers, of brushed aluminum and Gorilla Glass, of the faint, expensive cologne worn by men who measured their worth in billions. This was not a mere conference center. It was a cathedral built to the God of the modern age, the God of data, algorithms, and limitless human potential. At the center of the altar-like stage, bathed in the pure white light of a dozen spotlights, sat Bill Gates. He was more than a man here. He was an icon, the living embodiment of the revolution. His posture was relaxed, but his mind, everyone knew, was processing the world at a speed that left others behind. He was the high priest, the oracle, and his quiet confidence filled the vast space. The audience, a sea of faces, young, brilliant, and unyieldingly certain, hung on his every word. They were the disciples, the true believers in the power of the human mind to solve any problem, to conquer any frontier, to ultimately render the old world and its fragile beliefs obsolete. And then there was Senator John Neely Kennedy. He sat in the chair opposite Gates, a quiet island in an ocean of digital fervor. His dark, simple suit was a stark contrast to the casual, calculated non-fashion of Silicon Valley. He had been invited as a curiosity, a voice of tradition, to provide a counterpoint that was meant to be easily, almost playfully, dismantled. In the summit's program, he was labeled a moral philosopher. In the hushed conversations over artisanal coffee in the lobby, he was called a relic. He was a man of faith in a room full of men who kept their faith in Moore's law. He spoke of the soul in a place that only recognized the elegant logic of the chip. The tension was palpable, not because of any overt hostility, but because of the sheer, unbridgeable chasm between their worlds. It was the quiet, immense tension between a prayer and an algorithm. The moderator, a sharp, ambitious journalist from a major tech publication, turned to Gates. Her question was a perfectly crafted softball, designed to allow the Titan to articulate the room's unspoken creed. "Mr. Gates," she began, her voice crisp, "we are on the cusp of AGI. We're editing the human genome with CRISPR. We are planning cities on Mars. In a world where we are solving the fundamental problems of existence with logic and technology, isn't it fair to say that ancient systems of belief, including organized religion, have become a sentimental but ultimately inefficient legacy system? A bug, rather than a feature, in humanity's code?" A wave of appreciative murmurs rippled through the audience. This was their truth. Gates adjusted his glasses, a gesture that signaled a thought process crystallizing into a clear, irrefutable statement. "It's more than fair to say. It's the logical conclusion," he stated, his voice calm and precise. "Think of it in terms of operating systems. For millennia, humanity ran on Faith 1.0. It was a remarkable piece of software for its time. It provided social cohesion, a framework for morality, and comfort in the face of the unknown. It explained lightning as the wrath of a god because it lacked the data of meteorology. It explained plagues as divine punishment because it lacked the germ theory of disease." He paused, letting the analogy sink in. "But we don't run our lives on outdated software. We update, we patch, we replace. Science, reason, data. This is humanity 2.0. It's faster, more reliable, and it's built on verifiable, testable principles. We are systematically replacing the mysteries that required faith with facts that require understanding. We are eradicating poverty not with prayer, but with logistical networks and microfinancing. We are fighting disease not with appeals to a higher power, but with mRNA vaccines and genomic sequencing. The future isn't about hoping for a better world. It's about engineering one." He then gestured subtly, almost dismissively, in Kennedy's direction. "With all due respect to the senator and the traditions he represents, we cannot drive into the future while looking in the rearview mirror. Holding on to these ancient narratives is like a programmer insisting on using a punch card system in the age of quantum computing. It's nostalgic, perhaps, It might even feel comfortable. But it is fundamentally incompatible with progress. Faith is a beautifully decorated cage, and the door has been open for centuries. It's time we had the courage to step out. The applause was thunderous. It was a roar of self-affirmation. He hadn't just answered a question, he had delivered their sermon. He had validated their life's work, their entire worldview. In their minds, the debate was already over. The relic had been kindly but firmly placed back in the museum. As the applause for Gates subsided, a thick, expectant silence descended upon the hall. It was a silence filled with smug certainty. The faces in the audience were alight with intellectual satisfaction. They had just heard their own sophisticated beliefs articulated by their highest authority. The argument was clean, logical, and complete. Now for the formality. The moderator turned to Kennedy, her expression a careful blend of professional courtesy and unconcealed pity. It was the look of someone asking a child to explain their belief in Santa Claus in front of a panel of physicists. "Senator Kennedy," she said, her voice softening into a tone one might use for a respected but out-of-touch elder. "Your response?" Every eye in the room fixed on the man from Louisiana. The collective gaze was a heavy blanket of skepticism. They expected a fumbling defense, perhaps a cherry-picked quote from scripture, an emotional appeal to tradition that would sound hollow and quaint in this temple of reason. They anticipated a speech about the good works of churches, about the comfort of community, all things that, in their view, could be optimized and delivered more efficiently through a well-designed social app. Some shifted in their seats, readying themselves for a moment of polite endurance before the next, more relevant session on neural lace technology began. Kennedy did not move immediately. He remained still, his hands resting calmly in his lap. He didn't look flustered or intimidated. Instead, he seemed to be absorbing the atmosphere of the room. He let the silence stretch, allowing the weight of their collective confidence to settle completely. His eyes weren't on the moderator or on Gates. They scanned the audience, moving from one brilliant, assured face to the next. He wasn't seeing a hostile crowd. He was seeing people. People of immense talent and power, people who had built empires of logic, but who, he knew, went home at night to the same quiet, unquantifiable questions that have haunted humanity since the dawn of time. He took a slow, deliberate breath, not as a prelude to a fight, but as a man preparing to speak a simple truth in a place that had forgotten its language. The smirk on a young programmer's face in the third row, the impatient tapping of a venture capitalist's pen, he saw it all. And he understood. They didn't think he had an answer for them. The irony was, he didn't intend to give one. He intended to ask a better question. Finally, Kennedy leaned slightly toward the microphone. The sound system was so perfect that the slight rustle of his suit jacket was audible throughout the hall. "Thank you, Mr. Gates, for that perspective," he began, his voice a low, gravelly hum that was immediately distinct from the clipped, precise tones that had preceded it. It was the sound of old wood, not polished steel. "It's a powerful argument. Now, I'm not a computer scientist. I'm just a country lawyer from Louisiana. And most of my life has been spent listening not to CEOs, but to ordinary folks. So, if you'll indulge me, I'd like to tell you a short story. It's not about code. It's about a farmer." A few scattered, almost inaudible chuckles rippled through the front rows. A farmer. The archetype of the pre-digital man. The contrast was so stark it was almost comical. But Kennedy's placid expression didn't change. "His name was Clyde Boudreaux," Kennedy continued, his voice steady. "He grew sugarcane down in the bayou. Been in his family for 4 generations. And Clyde was a brilliant farmer. Mr. Gates, you would have appreciated his mind. He used satellite imagery to monitor crop density. He used GPS-guided tractors that could plant a row straight as a laser beam for 3 miles. He had soil sensors that told him the precise nitrogen and potassium levels in every quadrant of his land. He had spreadsheets tracking yields, rainfall, and commodity futures going back 30 years. He had mastered his system. He controlled every variable that a man could possibly control. He let that image settle. The tech-savvy farmer, a man who embraced progress. He was speaking their language, but with a different accent. Clyde was an expert. He'd built a small empire of efficiency on that muddy patch of land. But there was one thing, one variable that always lay outside his control. He could track it. He could model its potential impact. He could prepare for it. But he couldn't stop it. Kennedy paused, his gaze sweeping across the room. The audience was leaning in now, caught by the simple narrative pull. "The hurricane," he said softly. Every year, around late August, he would start watching the weather reports from the coast of Africa. And he knew that all his technology, all his data, all his brilliant, hard-won knowledge was utterly, completely helpless against a column of wind and water that was 100 miles wide. He could reinforce the barn doors. He could move his equipment to high ground. He could pray, but he could not command the storm to turn. And in those moments, watching that spiral on the screen grow larger, I saw the strong, intelligent, capable man become very, very small. And very, very humble. Not because he was ignorant, but because he was wise enough to know the precise boundary of his own power. Kennedy shifted his gaze from the audience and looked directly at Bill Gates. The connection was immediate and intense. The polite, academic distance of the debate vanished, replaced by something deeply personal. "Mr. Gates, you and these brilliant minds in this room," he said, his voice retaining its calm but gaining a new, profound weight, "you are the most magnificent farmers in the history of the world. You are cultivating the fields of human knowledge, and your harvest is changing civilization. You are mastering the variables of existence on a scale Clyde Boudreaux could never have imagined. But you are forgetting about the hurricane." The silence in the room was now absolute. It was no longer a silence of skepticism, but of sudden, rapt attention. The metaphor had found its mark. "And I don't mean a literal storm," Kennedy clarified, his voice dropping even lower, becoming more intimate. "The hurricane is the diagnosis the doctor gives you that no algorithm could have predicted. It's the phone call in the middle of the night that shatters your world in an instant. It's the betrayal of a friend, the gnawing emptiness of success, the look of confusion in your child's eyes when they ask you a question about death and you, with all your genius, have no answer. It is the sudden, terrifying awareness of your own fragility and your own mortality. That, gentlemen and ladies, is the source code of the human condition. And you did not write it." He saw a flicker in Gates's eyes. The analytical shield was still there, but behind it, something had been touched. Gates was a man who had faced his own storms, public and private. He knew what Kennedy was talking about, not as a concept, but as a reality. "You speak of faith as an outdated operating system for the world," Kennedy continued, his words measured and deliberate. "And maybe you're right if you're talking about a system to manage supply chains or optimize a search engine. But you're missing the point. Faith is not an operating system for a computer. It is the operating system for the human soul. And its most critical function doesn't activate when everything is working perfectly. It activates when everything breaks. It boots up when your own code returns a fatal error. It takes over when the system you built, the one you trusted and controlled, has crashed completely, leaving you in the dark. Faith is not the explanation for how lightning works. It's the reason you can rebuild your home after the lightning strike." Kennedy leaned back slightly, giving the room a moment to process. He had laid the foundation, and now he was building upon it, piece by undeniable piece. "Your stated mission, and it's a noble one, is to debug humanity. To fix the glitches. Poverty, disease, ignorance, these are bugs, and you are creating the patches to fix them. And I thank God for your work. You have saved millions of lives and improved millions more. But you are mistaken about one thing. The most fundamental aspect of our humanity is not a bug to be fixed." He let his eyes drift across the faces of the young programmers, the data scientists, the AI visionaries. "Our vulnerability is not a bug. Our need for grace is not a bug. Our capacity for awe, for wonder, for a love that defies all logic and self-interest, that is not a bug. Our conscience, that quiet, persistent voice that tells us the difference between what is clever and what is right, that is the master feature of our design. You seek to create an artificial intelligence that can outthink us. But can you create one that can forgive us? Can you code for mercy? Can you write an algorithm for redemption?" The questions hung in the air, simple, profound, and utterly outside the scope of their work. He had changed the terms of the debate from the solvable to the transcendent. "You are building a world of perfect information," he said, his voice resonating with a deep, quiet authority. "You believe that with enough data you can eliminate uncertainty and create a perfect, predictable world. But a world without mystery is a world without meaning. A life without the possibility of failure is a life without the need for courage. A universe that can be entirely explained by a human mind is, forgive me, too small a universe." He turned one last time to Gates, a look of genuine, non-confrontational empathy on his face. "You speak of the future being written in the language of code. I believe that. But you are only reading one language. There is another, older one. It's not written in ones and zeros. It is written in the silence between heartbeats. It is written in the act of selfless sacrifice. It is written in the humbling, terrifying, and ultimately beautiful realization that we are not and were never meant to be our own creators. You are trying to build a better machine. Faith reminds us that we are more than machines to begin with." Kennedy finished speaking. He simply stopped, leaving his last words to hang in the vast, silent hall. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't condemned or accused. He had simply held up a mirror, and the reflection it showed was one they hadn't seen in a long time. The silence that followed was different from all the silences that had come before. It was not expectant, not skeptical, not even merely attentive. It was a heavy, profound, and deeply internal silence. It was the sound of 1,000 brilliant minds simultaneously hitting a question for which they had no data set. The young programmer in the third row was no longer smirking. He was staring at his own hands, resting on his state-of-the-art laptop as if seeing them for the first time not as tools for writing code, but as finite, human hands. A woman who ran a multi-billion-dollar venture capital fund known for her aggressive, cutthroat negotiating style had a strange, soft look on her face, a look of distant memory. The entire room, once a monolith of shared certainty, had fractured into 1,000 individual points of contemplation. Kennedy's words had bypassed their intellectual firewalls and gone straight to the place where their own private hurricanes raged. But the most telling reaction was on the stage. Bill Gates sat perfectly still. The easy, confident posture was gone. He wasn't looking at Kennedy, but at a fixed point in the middle distance. His face, usually a mask of calm, analytical intelligence, showed the faintest tremor of something else. It wasn't defeat. It wasn't anger. It was something far more complex. It was the look of a master architect who has just been shown a fundamental flaw in his own foundation, a flaw not of engineering, but of philosophy. He, the man who had built an empire on finding the answers, had been confronted with the humbling power of the unanswerable. The quiet man from Louisiana hadn't defeated him with a better argument. He had unsettled him with a deeper truth. The polished glass of the technocratic worldview had just shown its first hairline crack. The silence held for what felt like an eternity. The moderator, who had been so poised and in control, seemed utterly lost. The script for the summit had been derailed not by a technical glitch, but by a human one. The carefully constructed narrative of the day had been gently but completely undone. Then, from the back of the auditorium, a single person began to clap. It wasn't the explosive, percussive clap of adulation. It was slow, measured, and thoughtful. Another person joined in, then another and another. The sound grew, but it never became a roar. It was a somber, rolling wave of applause and acknowledgement of something profound. It was the sound of a room full of people who thought they had all the answers, thanking the man who had reminded them of the importance of the questions. They weren't clapping for a debater who had won. They were clapping for a truth they had forgotten. John Kennedy gave a slight, humble nod, a gesture of thanks not to the audience, but to the moment itself. He had come into the cathedral of progress not to tear it down, but to open a window. He had reminded the architects of the future that their blueprints were incomplete if they did not account for the timeless architecture of the human soul. As the summit eventually resumed, the energy had changed. The discussions continued, the presentations went on, but a new humility hung in the air. A question had been planted in the heart of the machine. The quiet words of the farmer's son from Louisiana would linger long after the spotlights were turned off. They would echo in the late-night coding sessions, in the boardrooms where the fate of millions was decided, and in the private moments of the powerful when they, too, would look up at the sky and feel the distant, gathering winds of a storm they could not control. The tech world had been silenced, not by an attack, but by an invitation to be human.